Hey guys, we got the new brokerage listing agreement last week. We also just recently have a modification to listing agreement updated as well. I'm going to highlight the important changes here so you have a quick reference point to go back to. So, most of the listing agreement is going to be similar to what you've seen already. However, I'm going to highlight the three major portions that have changed. One, we talked about concessions previously, offering concessions to a buyer's broker where a buyer can utilize those funds to pay their buyer's broker agreement, the commission fees, whatever. So they have the concession amount here on line 39, and notice it's only a dollar amount that you can put in here. Florida realtors did not want it to look like you're using concessions to pay buyer's brokerage commissions, so they don't have a percentage here. If you want to offer a percentage as a concession, you can still do that. You just have to put that in the other terms section that 2 or 3% of the sale price is going to the buyer's closing costs. Now, I would encourage you use the concession amount for just that. Approach your listing agreements as if your seller is going to offer compensation to a buyer's broker, and use a concession strictly for that. If they want to offer a concession up front to a buyer's closing costs, just use it for that. I'm going to show you here on page 3 where we can add in the buyer's broker compensation. But first, the major change over here is the compensation for the listing side. So line number 8 here, line 109, this is where you have compensation from the seller to you, the listing agent, the listing broker. So this is where you're negotiating your commission with the seller. Let's just assume it's a 3% commission. You're going to put that right here, 3% of the total purchase price. And that's where the seller is agreeing to pay you as a listing broker 3%. Now, down below on line 143, number 10, this is where you're going to see the compensation to buyers brokers. You have three different selections here, A, B, and C. So A authorizes the broker to offer compensation in the amount of blank percent. Let's just say that's 3% as well. And this amount will be paid from the broker to the buyer's broker. So if you select A here, that means the brokerage is paying the buyer's brokerage commission. So you have to take this into account if you're selecting A, because up here where you're negotiating with the seller, if you only have 3% in here, that's total what the seller is paying. And if you put down here, check A, and you're offering 3% here, that means 3% is going to the buyer's broker from the broker's commissions, and that leaves you with nothing. So when you select A down here, compensation to buyer's broker, you have to take into account up here that you would want to negotiate, let's just say 6%, put that 6% here. And then when you check A, this is, let's say, 3%. That's your typical 50-50 like you've done in your other listing agreements for years and years and years. That's kind of how you would set that up in that same traditional format. But just keep in mind that if you're going to select A, this means that the funds are coming from the brokerage, not from the seller. And so whatever you negotiate up here in letter A, that percentage is coming off of that. So just keep that in mind. Now, B here also gives broker compensation, but the compensation is coming directly from the seller, and this is where you would have that separate written agreement. The seller is paying the buyer's broker X amount. So when you click B here, this is outside of what you've negotiated for yourself up in compensation from the seller on A here. So B here is a separate number. So maybe you negotiate 3% for yourself up here, and the seller says, "Well, I don't want to give 3% to the buyer, but you know what? I'm willing to give him 1% or 2% or whatever that number is." That's where you would select B here and put that percentage in. The last one here is just if they want to offer no compensation to the buyer's broker. And then everything else is generally pretty much the same. One thing to take note of, and you'll see this in the webinar if you watch it, it's only about 90 minutes, so I highly encourage you, make sure you watch that webinar. But down here under dispute resolution, so notice there's a couple of initials right here. The only time your seller and broker or authorized associate is going to initial here is if you choose that you want to arbitrate and not do mediation. So this is not something that you guys need to have signed by the seller or yourselves unless they specifically want to arbitrate in the case of a dispute resolution. Um, so that's not necessarily necessary to have initial. All right, guys. So those are the major changes and what you need to consider with these listing agreements. The newest modification to listing agreement here, I'm going to include that in the email. It's an attachment. The blue here shows what changes were made to the modification, but essentially they've added in this area here for compensation to buyer's broker. And also updated some of the conditional termination language as well. But the main thing here on the modification is that they've added the compensation to buyer's broker here. All right, guys. So good luck. If you have any questions, if you're not sure how to fill this out, or you just need some general tools and tips on how to approach your sellers, give me a call and we'll be happy to help. Talk to you soon and go sell some stuff.